Okay, so how are genes and the environment working together? Because we've already established from the outset that they are constantly working together. Well, we are, as researchers, always trying to figure out how best to study this. Okay, there is one area of research called behavioral genetics that tries to estimate what is called heritability. And heritability is the portion of individual differences that we can say are attributed to genes. Um, right, so it's the mathematical estimate of the degree of genetic influence for a given trait or behavior. And so, what does the individual difference part mean? Well, if I were to give everyone in the class an intelligence test, there would definitely be a range of scores. Would you agree? Right, so there would be some people that would score lower, some that would score higher. Those differences in scores are individual differences. So, what is it that causes those individual differences? Is it genes or environment? That's what behavioral genetics is trying to get at with these heritability estimates. So it's a statistical estimate, and it's a number that ranges from 0 to 1. You interpret it like a proportion, so that, for instance, if your heritability estimate for intelligence is 0.80, then what you say is that 80% of the individual differences in intelligence are due to genes. And then what you do is you estimate the role of environment by subtraction. Right, so if the heritability estimate for intelligence is 0.80, then the influence of environment is assumed to be 20%. Um, Heritability estimates are interesting. They tend to be problematic in that they might overestimate the role of genes, and we'll talk about some reasons why that may be in a little bit. And it's also, since it's a statistical or mathematical estimate, it relies on there being individual differences. So there has to, if you're looking at a trait um, that doesn't have a lot of individual difference, then the heritability estimate won't work. Right? So with intelligence, that's going to be something that does have a lot of individual difference, that we're definitely going to see a range of scores there. But if you were to look at something like being born with two eyes, right? There's very little individual difference there, although there may be some people that are not born with two eyes. They're going to be such a small number that it doesn't, there's not a lot of individual difference there, that pretty much everyone is. But because the heritability estimate relies on there being individual difference, it doesn't work as a statistic for a trait like being born with two eyes. The heritability estimate would be somewhere around 0, which doesn't make any sense, especially since being born with two eyes is completely determined by our DNA and our genes. Okay, so you want to be a little bit wary of heritability estimates because they tend to overestimate the role of genes, and it is a mathematical estimate that has its own quirks and problems, and we'll talk about some of that in a little bit. Another way to look at how much heredity is contributing to our traits is to look at concordance rates. So you can look at identical twins. Right? What percentage of genes do identical twins share? They share 100% because they came from the same zygote. They came from the same cell, and they were just divided into two, and so they share 100% of their genes. Right, so what you're looking at is, for a particular trait, for these individuals that share 100% of their genes, what percentage of the time do they both share the particular trait or characteristic? So you can get a number that ranges from 0 to 100%, right? So 100% concordance rate means that if one twin has the trait or the characteristic, then the other twin always has it as well. And what's interesting is that even for some things that we think are very much genetically influenced, you don't always get a 100% concordance rate. So for something like schizophrenia, for instance, which we do think is related to our genes, you don't get a concordance rate of 100%, that sometimes you have one identical twin that has the disorder and the other that doesn't. Now, getting back to heritability, how is it that we estimate this, right? How do we get that mathematical estimate of the proportion of a trait that is due to genes versus the environment? Well, the way that they do it is through twin studies and adoption studies. And so, in a twin study, one possibility is to compare identical twins to fraternal twins. So, we've already said that identical twins share 100% of their genes. What percentage do fraternal twins share? Well, they share about 50%. So they're the same as any other set of siblings. The only difference is that they happen to be born at the same time. Okay. So, what you're looking for is whether identical twins are more similar to one another on a particular trait than fraternal twins. Right, so let's say that your theory is that intelligence is largely due to genes. If that's your theory, then your hypothesis would be that identical twins would have more strongly correlated intelligence test scores than fraternal twins. Okay, and so if identical twins are found to be more similar on that trait of intelligence test than dizygotic twins or fraternal twins, then you can say that that similarity in intelligence is due to genes, and any difference then is estimated to be the role of the environment. And that is sort of how that is done. Okay, if you're looking at identical twins reared apart, then what you're comparing is the identical twins to one another and then to their adoptive relatives. Right, so you're again, these are identical twins that are not reared in the same environment. But if you expect something like intelligence to be genetically related, then you would still expect these identical twins to be more closely related to each other in terms of their intelligence test scores than they would be to their adopted relatives. And then with adoption studies, same thing here. You compare adopted children's traits to both their biological and their adoptive parents. And if they have a stronger correlation with their biological parents, then you assume that the trait is related more to genetics than to the environment. Okay, and there are some problems with these approaches and the conclusions that are drawn. So remember I said that heritability estimates tend to overestimate the role of genes versus the environment. Well, think about identical twins versus fraternal twins. What is unique about identical twins? Well, they look exactly alike. Fraternal twins do not. And so in some ways, the identical twins may actually have more similar environments than the fraternal twins do in terms of how others react to them, in terms of how they the kinds of experiences and opportunities they have in their environment. With fraternal twins, you could have a boy and a girl. You could have two children that look very different from one another, just like any other set of siblings. And so they may not be treated the same way that the identical twins are. So if you have a similar environment, then that would tend to make it look like the trait is more due to genes, right, than it is to the environment. But it's overlooking the role of the environment. So let's talk a little bit more about how genes and environment are working together. So one way to think about how genes and environment are working together is through this theoretical notion of range of reaction. So range of reaction is just the range of possible phenotypes, right? The range of possible traits or behaviors that can exist for a particular genotype. So the idea is that our genes kind of set the limits. Our genes set the boundaries for how much role the environment can play in determining a particular outcome in terms of a trait, right? So for instance, if you have two parents that are both 5'5", okay, um, that's going to set some limits in terms of how tall you can actually be as one of their offspring, right? That you're inheriting specific genes that probably don't allow for you to be 6'8", okay? So your genes kind of set the boundaries, but then of course within those boundaries there is environmental influence. So what in the environment can influence how tall you actually end up becoming? Well, your nutrition, right? Or your health. Those things can influence how tall you actually end up becoming. So the idea behind range of reaction is that your genes set the bounds, and then the environment has an influence within those bounds. And for some traits, you're going to have a wider range of reaction, right, where there's more room for the environment to have an influence. And for other traits, you're going to have a more narrow range of reaction where the environment doesn't have as much room. Now, the trouble is that this is really just a theoretical notion. We can never really know for certain the range of reaction for a specific individual because it's impossible to know all of the environmental possibilities during a limited time of one person's development. You can't sort of estimate all of the possibilities in terms of the environment. But another way to think about range of reaction is that because our genes set these boundaries, the environment is going to have a different impact for different people. Okay, so that's what this chart is basically showing. So if you have individuals with different genotypes in either extremely unstimulating or highly enriched environments, their reactions to those different environments are very different because of their different genotypes, right? So in Ben's case, he actually does best at a middle range quality of environment, right? Whereas Ron does best at a highly enriched level, and Ben, right, shows the same kind of pattern. So this is why one environmental influence can have a particular impact on an individual and have a completely different impact on another individual. And I'm sure you've seen examples of this in life, right, where maybe one individual is completely torn apart by having a negative experience in childhood, like child abuse, and another individual seems to be extremely resilient and rise above it and turn out okay despite having such a negative experience. Related to this notion of range of reaction is a term called canalization. If you think about what a canal is, right, it's a very narrow passageway. And so canalization has to do with certain traits and characteristics having a very narrow range of reaction, where the role of the environment plays very little role for the development of that particular trait. And the best example of this is infant babbling, that all infants begin to babble at about the same age, somewhere around 6 to 8 months. And it doesn't matter what language they've been exposed to, they all kind of sound the same when they begin to babble. They're babbling all kinds of kind of sounds the same. Over time, the babbling will start to take on the intonations of the native language that they're exposed to. So even though they're not speaking, they kind of start to sound like their native language through their babbling. Now, what's interesting is that children that are born deaf and that have parents that use sign language at home, they start to show what's called sign babble at about the same time that other children start to babble vocally. So even with something as extreme as that, right, they're still showing the same basic behavior. And so that's a very canalized behavior, that there's not much room for the environment to have an influence. Other ways to think about how genes and environment are working together is to look at how they're correlated. And to think about gene environment correlation is another explanation for why heritability estimates might overestimate the role of genes when looking at particular traits and characteristics. Because oftentimes what you have is genes in the environment working in very similar ways to produce a particular trait or characteristic. And what that heritability estimate does is it just assumes that all of that similarity is due to genes versus the environment. So, one type of correlation is a passive gene environment correlation. And what that means is passively you're receiving your genes from your parents, and early in development you're also receiving your environment from your parents, right? So in early development your parents kind of set up that environment for you. Even before you're born, they start to decide what clothes you're going to wear, what your nursery is going to look like, what kinds of toys you're going to be provided with, right? So very early on you're receiving both those genes and the environment from your parents. Now, as an example, let's say that you have two very musically talented parents, and your parents are both instructors at Juilliard, right? They're so talented. And then they have you as a child, and you at a very young age start to show some musical talent. And the tendency would be to explain that as, well, this child inherited his or her musical ability from his parents. And then that's the mistake that heritability estimates make, right? Because what else is probably going on in that child's environment? It's not just about what they've inherited genetically, but in the environment, they're probably exposed to music a whole lot. They're probably given music lessons at a very early age, formally or informally. They're probably encouraged to engage in musical activity, right? And so in this case, you have genes and environment working very closely together in similar ways to produce a particular outcome. So they're both involved, but the heritability estimate would take that particular trait and say this is largely due to genes. In evocative correlation, to evoke means to bring about, right? And so the idea here is that our genetic predispositions, our genetic traits and characteristics, evoke certain reactions from the environment that then lead to particular developmental outcomes. So think about babies with different temperaments, right? So everyone's heard parents describe some babies as being easy babies. And an easy baby is a baby that doesn't cry very much. They're pretty easily soothed. They get on a schedule pretty easily, right? And a difficult baby is the opposite. They cry a lot. You don't know what to do to soothe them. They don't get on a schedule very easily. Is it possible that these two different kinds of children are going to evoke certain reactions, different reactions from their parents? Yes, right. And it's interesting if you look at difficult temperament, those children tend to grow up to have more difficult behaviors, but it's not all about genetics. If you look at the parenting that they're receiving from early on, these parents tend to be more frustrated, they tend to be more harsh in their parenting, and so you have the genes and the environment really working closely together in this case to produce a particular outcome. It's not just the genes by themselves, it's how those genes and the trait that go with it that kind of evoke a certain response from the environment. And then the last correlation is the active correlation or niche picking. And this recognizes that we are active in our own development, that at some point we start to choose our own environments, right? So as we develop, as we grow, we start to choose activities, environments that kind of fit with our specific traits and characteristics, our specific strengths and weaknesses. And so someone who is has a genetic propensity to be very athletic, right down the road might actually choose to participate in lots of athletic activities. And so those two environments again, the environment and the genes are working together to produce an athletic individual. Okay, so this active correlation could help explain why sometimes identical twins that are reared apart end up being very, very similar to one another. If you've ever seen examples of this, right, where you have these twins that have never met and yet they look very similar. They might both have facial hair, they have similar jobs, their spouses look very much alike, right? And that would be the active correlation that they have the specific genetic propensity, but because of that genetic propensity, they choose environments in particular ways. And then that environment in turn has an influence on their development. Finally, what you want to keep in mind is epigenesis. The epigenetic framework just explains that development takes place through all of these bidirectional exchanges between heredity and all levels of the environment, right? That it's not just genes having an influence on behavior, but behavior can also have an influence on genetic expression, right? Your behavior, of course, is going to have an impact on the environment, and the environment certainly has an impact on your behavior. Right? So all of these different levels are interacting with one another in bidirectional ways. So just to remember that it's not just a unidirectional relationship from genes to behavior to environment, but that everything is having an influence on everything else. And it's a very complex picture, and that's what makes it very difficult to identify what genes might be involved in particular traits or characteristics. Okay, so that's it for this particular lecture. Um, what I would recommend is there is a video called Cracking the Genetic Code. All you have to do is in your search engine online type in cracking the genetic code, and you'll get a link to a NOVA program that talks all about these genetic issues. And so it's a nice supplement to the lecture and helps to explain some things in a little bit more detail. So I would definitely recommend checking that out. Otherwise, until next time.